Hello, my name is Justin Whitcomb, and I am the lead pastor of Veritas Bible Church in Warren, Michigan. I just want to welcome you back to another video in our series on biblical theology. In this video, we're going to discuss the period of God's special revelation that takes place between Noah and the great patriarchs Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And so the outcomes for this video are to identify the prophetic deliverances of Noah, to explain the confusion of tongues, and to review the election of the Shemites. But before we move forward, we're going to provide a brief recap of what we looked at in our last video. So, in our last video, we examined what was referred to as the Noachian revelation, and that was kind of a summative term. But we were looking particularly at what was known as the pre-Diluvian and post-Diluvian special revelations. Now, that term comes from the Latin to wash away. So, what we were looking at in particular was the revelation that took place between the fall and the flood. So, the pre-Diluvian, and then as well as the special revelation that took place immediately following the flood. And so, what we saw in the pre-Diluvian was a minimum of God's grace. And so, following the flood, you see somewhat of a withdrawing of God's grace, and he allows sin to cultivate and grow. And this reveals the great progressing power of sin. We see that during this time, sin uh, begins to spread and grow and become robust. But we also saw the continuity of redemption within the line of Seth. Now, following the post-Diluvian revelation, this is again the immediate aftermath of the flood. We saw that God's redemptive plan is seen through constructive measures, and so he is establishing grounds in which he is going to preserve his plan of redemption. We see that God will no longer curse the ground because of man. He's making the declaration that because man is sinful in his nature now, that there's no amount of inflicting judgment in this way that is going to right the course of man's sin. Also, God made available all sustenance for man. So we saw that in addition to the fruit of the trees and the produce of the ground, that animals were now available for that same sustenance. Also, God establishes a divine law for the protection of man. And so he states that he is going to effectively protect man from the wild beasts, as well as in Genesis 9, we see a declaration against prohibition against the murder of humans. And then ultimately, God seals these promises with a physical sign, which is the promises of the covenant. He seals that with the covenantal sign of the rainbow. And so this brings us to this next period of God's revelation. Again, the time between Noah, the immediate aftermath of the flood, and then up into the great patriarchs of the faith, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And so it's this passage that sets the stage for the prophetic utterances that are to come from Noah concerning his children and their heritage. The text says here in Genesis 9:18 through 23, the sons of Noah who went forth from the ark were Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Ham was the father of Canaan. These three were the sons of Noah, and from these the people of the whole earth were dispersed. Noah began to be a man of the soil, and he planted a vineyard. He drank the wine and became drunk and laid uncovered in his tent. And Ham, the father of Canaan, saw the nakedness of his father and told his two brothers outside. Then Shem and Japheth took a garment, laid it on both their shoulders, and walked backwards and covered the nakedness of their father. Their faces were turned backward, and they did not see their father's nakedness. And so we see that out of the shameless sensuality of Ham and the modesty of Japheth and Shem, we see the signs of elements that will be perpetuated through natural development. We see that God is going to allow evil to continue its progression. And we see this again, the immediate actions, the shameless actions of Ham, as well as we're going to see at the same time that God is preserving his plan of redemption. And we'll see that primarily through the person of Shem. The first component that is revealed to us concerning these two continued themes is that evil will continue to have its presence among man. So Genesis 9:24 through 25 says, when Noah awoke from his wine and knew what his youngest son had done to him, he said, cursed be Canaan, a servant of servants shall he be to his brothers. We aren't given much of a reason for why the curse of Ham is bestowed upon Canaan. However, the logical implication we can draw from the text is that the curse is put upon his son because his sin was against his father. The curse being given in this fashion also alludes to the fact that evil committed by Ham will be perpetuated in his line. Deuteronomy 12:29 through 30 says, when the Lord your God cuts off before you the nations whom you go in to dispossess, you dispossess them and dwell in their land. Take care that you be not ensnared to follow them after they have been destroyed before you, and that you do not inquire about their gods, saying, how did these nations serve their gods, that I also might do the same. You see, the Israelites are given this warning about the people who were in the promised land. God is condemning their wickedness and exhorting Israel to be prepared in their hearts for the defensive. But we have to ask the question, what people did the land belong to, the promised land? Well, it belonged to the Canaanites. And this is why we can look confidently at Genesis 9 and the curse upon Canaan and draw out the implication of evil's remaining presence. You see, the blessing upon Shem reveals a preserved line of redemption, where the curse of Ham is God revealing the continued presence of evil among the nations of the world. The blessing upon Shem reveals something of the opposite nature. It is in the blessing upon Shem that God reveals his preserving, that he is preserving a line of redemption. Genesis 9:26 says, he also said, blessed be the Lord, the God of Shem, let Canaan be his servant. In the blessing on Shem, Noah uses the proper name of God, Yahweh, to provide precision to the blessing. The wording of this blessing is done in particular to show that the line of Shem wouldn't simply worship Yahweh, but rather would belong to Yahweh. It would be through this line that redemption would continue, and the line of Ham through Canaan would be made subservient to his. This gives the imagery that God is going to make a way in which the power of sin is made subordinate. We also see that the blessing upon Japheth reveals the great scope of redemption. So we see the preserved line of redemption within the line of Shem, but we'll see the scope of redemption in the line of Japheth. You see, while the blessing upon Shem carries precision that reveals God's preserved plan of redemption through the Shemites, the blessing upon Japheth reveals that the scope of redemption will go beyond Shem's line. We see here that the text says, may God enlarge Japheth and let him dwell in the tents of Shem and let Canaan be his servant. And so we see here that the phrase let him dwell in the tents of Shem, when understood in context, gives a profound insight into God's plan of redemption. While it can come off in our context that the line of Shem is simply maybe making space for the line of Japheth, the term enlarge that is used earlier gives us a different understanding. Based on the historical context of the phrase, what is being conveyed here is that Japheth's line will grow and overtake some territory of Shem. It doesn't mean that the people of Shem will be driven out, rather, they will be forced to share their land. They will be occupied. Dr. Geerhardus Vos makes a profound observation concerning the actualizing of this prophecy in history. In history, this fulfillment can be seen through the territorial conquests of the Greeks and the Romans of the Jewish land. However, as this took place, they entered into the place in which God resides with his people. In doing so, those who didn't belong to the preserved line of redemption were shown redemption and revelation. And it was through this fulfillment that we see the spread of redemption through the face of the earth. A German theologian, Franz Delitzsch, once said, we are all Japhethites dwelling in the tents of Shem. And this brings us to discussing the confusion of tongues. And so the lines of man begin to progress, and mankind is concentrated, and they begin to do a work unto themselves. And so we see that ultimately God intercedes and he confuses the language of man. And so we see that the unity of humanity concentrated the power of sin. Genesis 11, 1 through 9 says, Now the whole earth had one language and the same words. As people migrated from the east, they found a plain in the land of Shinar and settled there. And they said to one another, Come, let us make bricks and burn them thoroughly. And they had brick for stone and bitumen for mortar. Then they said, Come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower with its tops in the heavens, and let us make a name for ourselves, lest we be dispersed over the face of the whole earth. And the Lord came down to see the city and the tower which the children of man had built. The Lord said, Behold, they are one people, and they have all one language, and this is only the beginning of what they will do. And nothing that they propose to do will now be impossible for them. Come, let us go down and therefore confuse their language, so they may not understand one another's speech. So the Lord dispersed them from there over the face of all the earth, and they left the building of the city. Therefore its name was called Babel, because there the Lord confused the language of all the earth. And from there the Lord dispersed them over the face of all the earth. So as we examine this narrative that discusses the development of the Tower of Babel, the city of Babel, we are presented with an initial motive. You see, they wanted to build a city and build a tower so that they wouldn't be dispersed over the face of the whole earth. However, as Dr. Vos notes, unity wasn't the ultimate purpose of the effort. They reveal their hand in the statement prior when it said, Let us make a name for ourselves. You see, the goal of this people was to exalt and glorify themselves in their independence from God. In fact, you can even look at the text and see in the language in the previous verses here in Genesis 11 that God refers them to as the children of man. And so, anytime you see that type of language being utilized, you can see that there is a distinguishing between God and those people. And so, you see here that there is a real motivation of sin, a motivation of pride that is at the ultimate foundation for this work. We see that God interferes with their plan for the sake of his promise. So, what is revealed additionally by this text is that while God certainly opposed that heart of sin and pride behind this project, he ultimately interferes with the plan in order to preserve his promise. Genesis 11, 6 through 7 says, And then the Lord said, Behold, they are one people, and they have all one language. And this is only the beginning of what they will do. And nothing that they propose to do will now be impossible for them. Come, let us go down, and there confuse their language, so that they may not understand one another's speech. You see, the Lord had seen what the result was for a condensed presence of sin. And so, in God's providence and grace, he dispersed the people by confusing their language. Even today, we see through national distinctions that this separation still exists as a check to power of sin's presence within a completely unified human race. Additionally, the separation of peoples led to the election of a chosen nation. And so, as we look to the outcome of Babel, we see that by the separating of these people, the stage has been set to pull out and preserve the line of redemption in what was becoming a sin polluted population. And so, this brings us then to the election of the Shemites. So, following the episode of Babel in Genesis 11, we're given the line of Shem all the way through to Abram, also known as Abraham. As we consider the genealogy in chapter 11 from Shem to Abram, we must remember what is said of Shem's line from the blessing of Noah in Genesis 9:26. Noah says, Blessed be the Lord, the God of Shem, and let Canaan be his servant. So we see that from Shem, God's line of redemption will be preserved. As we consider the religious endowment bestowed to the line of Shem, we need to ask some questions and analyze some components to understand what this preservation looked like. And the first question we ask then is, as we look through the Old Testament, we can look at the example of the Edomites who were ancestrally Shemites, and they were not monotheistic. And so we have to ask, was it the instinct of Shemites, was the instinct of Shemites monotheism? Well, again, it doesn't appear that way. So let's look and see what the prophet Jeremiah says about the people of Israel. Jeremiah 2:11 says, "Has a nation changed its gods, even though they are no gods? But my people have changed their glory, which which does not profit." Some have contended that the line of Shem was endowed with a new instinct. However, it is evident that the Shemites, including Israel, had the same sinful instinct to betray Yahweh. Even among, though, the polytheistic Shemites, the gods bore a resemblance. So while we consider the fact that Shemites struggled with the allure of polytheism, we see that Yahweh prepares Israel in their hearts to protect themselves against the gods of the lands that they are going to be dispossessing. While we see that there is this struggle and some blatantly participate in such practices, the gods constructed among the polytheistic Shemites bore similarity. As you look to the pagan gods of the nations, they did not share this similarity amongst each other. Another component to consider is the religious conscience that was common among the Shemite people, which was a religious conscience of submission. For example, consider the name Islam. The literal translation for the word Islam is submission. And this is a major reason for why the religions of people that shared a Shemitic descent had become the major religions of our time, is because religion is the driving force of their lives. We also see that the Shemites shared a posture of servanthood to deity. While the degree of personal relationship varies among Shemitic relationships, or Shemitic religions, there is a personal factor present in that the one who follows is a servant of their master. And so there was an inclination to separate God as transcendent above the created world and thus worthy of service. This was, again, not common amongst the pagan nations of that time. Oftentimes, the gods were not all that transcendent above the created world. And so we conclusively see that God preserves the higher religion of the Shemites. And so as we balance these components, we see a profound truth arise that the desire to serve Yahweh wasn't instinctual, though there were instincts to exalt and praise a deity. These instincts may have led to the worship of many different gods, but it always imitated the worship that was reserved for Yahweh. In God's election of the Shemites, we see a precisely preserved line being established. This is why we have the line of Shem to Abram given to us to show that among a people, to show us that among a people who was blessed to be Yahweh's people, that sin would pervert the best of their instincts, and as a result, the line of redemption needed to be preserved by the gracious hand of God. This preservation has been experienced through the gift of divine revelation. And so this brings us to a close on our examination of the period of time of God's special revelation between Noah and the great patriarchs. In the next video, we're going to examine God's special revelation amidst the great patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Hope you'll join us for that video. God bless.